It's really exciting to see the ID research program blossoming. I'm going to give you just a little taste of some of the research we're doing in our program today. But when you get this objection that ID isn't science, there are multiple layers of responses. In fact, we can do what us lawyers call arguing in the alternative. So I want to ask this question as I start off this presentation. I'm sure many of you talk to people about intelligent design. Maybe some of you actually go out and give presentations on intelligent design. But how many of you ever had this experience? You make a careful, compelling, well-documented case for intelligent design, maybe based upon the presence of information in DNA, protein complexity, molecular machines, fine-tuning of the universe, all those great arguments for design. But then the angry man comes out, right? And he says, you can't argue that. You can't argue for intelligent design. So what do you think is the angry man's number one objection? By the way, I asked AI to make me a picture of an angry man, and it drew kind of a short guy with thick eyebrows. Like, oh my, that kind of looks like me. Hopefully I'm not the angry man. But what do you think is the angry man's number one objection to intelligent design? I know it's probably too much space in here for us to shout out answers. So I'm going to, sometimes people will say ID isn't falsifiable, or there are no scientists who support intelligent design. Well, in my experience, the number one objection that I hear after giving a presentation for intelligent design is this. The angry man says, you can't say that because ID is not science. It doesn't use the scientific method. It's not testable. It doesn't do research, and it doesn't publish peer-reviewed scientific papers. And this is not just sort of an abstract, intramural academic exercise. This objection has real-world implications, because it is this objection that is the primary reason that ID is being kept out of the scientific community, why it's being rejected by courts, why it isn't taught in schools, why it isn't covered fairly in the media, why you don't see ID at science museums, and even why your next door neighbor, Bob the angry atheist, why he doesn't accept intelligent design, okay? So there are real world implications for what this objection does for the ID evolution debate. So I'd like to think that I'm somewhat well situated to discuss this objection because I'm essentially the de facto research director at Discovery Institute. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen this sort of meme that's out there. It says, who I think I am, who they think I am, and who I really am. Any of you guys ever seen that meme? So I decided to do that meme for myself, okay? So this is who I think I am. I'm like, Batman running the ID research program for the whole world, but then this is like who the critics think I am. I'm this squeaky weirdo guy with devil horns, wearing a MAGA hat in Seattle, who's doing all these terrible things. But the reality, you guys, is this is who I really am, okay? I'm just this really tired guy who's online all the time, Zooming with people. If anybody wants to work long hours for no pay, you can come be my assistant. I really need you, let me tell you. I need some help. So basically, we are working with scientists all around the world, and it's really exciting to see the ID research program blossoming. I'm gonna give you just a little taste of some of the research we're doing in our program today. But when you get this objection that ID isn't science, there are multiple layers of responses. In fact, this objection fails for so many reasons, both theoretical and practical, that we can do what us lawyers call arguing in the alternative, okay? So if we have our little angry man here, and he's saying that ID isn't science, here's the first reason that I would say he's wrong. First of all, there's no consensus definition of science, okay? You can't say that ID isn't science if there's no standardly accepted definition of science, all right? So you can't argue against ID being science if there really is no philosophers of science don't have a definition of science that they universally accept. Number two, ID meets rigorous methodological definitions of science. What do I mean by this? Well, intelligent design uses the scientific methods of historical sciences to make positive, predictive, empirically testable claims which are supported by the evidence. Number three, ID also meets practical definitions of science, practical criteria of science. What do I mean by this? ID has an active research program that has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers showing that ID is a real science. You can actually do scientific research using intelligent design. Again, we'll talk more about that. Number four, by the way, you can see is with each argument, the little angry man gets lifted higher and higher into the air because his arguments get weaker and weaker. Number four, there are when people argue that ID is not science, sometimes they will apply what I would say arbitrary criteria for what qualifies as science. And these arbitrary requirements for science don't apply. Probably the most common requirement of science that people will impose is they will say that ID has to follow what is called methodological naturalism. What is methodological naturalism? Well, that's the idea that in science, you can only invoke natural mechanisms or material causes. If you invoke something like an intelligent cause, then by definition, you are not doing science. Well, the answer to that is as follows. ID doesn't follow the letter of methodological naturalism. Clearly, ID is not invoking a material cause when it says that an intelligent cause is responsible for what we see. But ID does follow the spirit behind methodological naturalism, because you can do predictable, reliable, testable science without assuming that naturalism or materialism are true. We're going to talk more about that. And finally, we have what Stephen Meyer calls the sauce for the goose argument. Basically, if evolution is science, so too must be intelligent design. And this is what we sometimes call the principle of equivalence. Basically, any non-arbitrary definition of science that qualifies evolution of science also is going to qualify intelligent design. And if some definition of science disqualifies ID, guess what? It's also going to disqualify evolution. So if you're an evolutionist and you're arguing that ID isn't science, you better be careful, because you might also be disqualifying evolution from being science as well. Okay, so we do not have time to go through all of these criteria and reasons why ID is science in great detail today. We're just going to focus on numbers 2 and 3, that ID meets practical criteria of science, and that ID meets rigorous methodological definitions of what science is. So, what is intelligent design? This is the definition that I like to use. It's very similar to Discovery Institute's definition, but here's what ID is. Intelligent design, or ID for short, is a scientific theory which uses the methods of historical sciences to infer that many features of nature are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an apparently undirected cause like natural selection, because those natural features exhibit forms of information and complexity which in our experience only come from intelligence. And this is really key. We're finding design in nature by finding forms of information and complexity which in our experience only come from intelligence. And there are certain key points about the theory of intelligent design that I want to emphasize and break down as we go through this today. Number one, ID is first and foremost a theory of design detection. We use ID to tell us through scientific methods when something was designed. Number two, ID is an historical science. That means that it is investigating whether design is the best explanation for certain events of the past. That's what historical sciences do. They investigate events of the past. Number three, ID uses a positive argument based upon finding in nature the kind of information and complexity which in our experience only come from an intelligent cause, from a mind. Number four, ID uses the scientific method to make its claims. And number five, ID can be applied to guide research that discovers how the natural world operates in the present day. So I know this is a lot of information, kind of a lot of jargon being thrown up here. Don't worry, I'm going to unpack each of these items, each of these arguments in great detail now over the rest of my talk. So ID is first and foremost a theory of design detection. How does ID work? What does that mean, and how does ID work? Well, some of you may have seen that our friend Bill Dembski is here with us today at this conference, and he has said that intelligent design can be formulated as a scientific theory, as a theory of information. Within such a theory, information becomes a reliable indicator of design as well as a proper object for scientific investigation. So basically, intelligent design is looking for information which is indicating to us that something was designed. So what exactly is the kind of information which tells us that something was designed? Well, here we can turn again to our friend Stephen Meyer. He has this great quote where he says, "Our experience-based knowledge of information flow confirms that systems with large amounts of specified complexity, especially codes and languages, invariably originate from an intelligent source, from a mind or a personal agent." Now, I know that Dr. Meyer throws out a lot of jargon in this quote as well, but what's he saying at heart here? He's saying that when we find certain kinds of information in our experience, they always come from an intelligent source, from a mind or a personal agent. So when we find that kind of information in nature, we are justified in saying that an intelligent cause was at work. And the kind of information which Dr. Meyer says always comes from a mind is what he calls specified complexity. And he gives two examples of that, codes in languages. And again, that's a very jargony term, and don't worry if you don't know what that means, because we're going to unpack that right now. So what do we mean by specified complexity, which is also called complex and specified information, or CSI for short? Well, roughly speaking, information is complex if it's unlikely, okay? So let's say that you're looking under the microscope and you see this microorganism that has this sequence of zeros and ones. 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if I was flipping a coin and every time I got a head, I put down a 1, and every time I got tails, I would put down a 0, this would be a very unlikely sequence of zeros and ones. So the question then comes up, is something being unlikely alone enough for us to say, oh, it was designed, enough for us to detect design? The answer to that question is no. The likelihood of every one of you sitting in this exact seat right now is actually very, very low. But we're not going to say that there's some, master seating chart that said that you all have to sit here, that this seating was designed. Or, when I'm in Texas, I love to use this example. If any of you guys play Texas Hold'em, if I were to give each of you out a 5-card hand of poker, the likelihood of you getting whatever hand of cards you get is actually very low. Even if you get a very good hand, like a royal flush, you're not going to necessarily say, oh, the deck was stacked to give me this exact hand of cards, because unlikely things happen all the time and we don't necessarily detect design. Something else has to be present for us to detect design, and that something else is what we call specification. It has to match an independent pattern. So it turns out that that sequence of zeros and ones that you saw in the previous slide, it's actually not a random sequence of zeros and ones. It is actually binary code that encodes ASCII characters in computer code that spells out this sentence in the English language. It says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. This is actually a quote from Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist who now says he's a cultural Christian, right? But Dawkins amazingly says that even though he thinks that natural selection is what did the designing, he admits that living organisms, living things look like they appear to be designed. Well, in the ID community, what we say is maybe the reason things appear designed is because they really were designed, right? But anyway, the point right now is that that sequence actually is not a random sequence, it is specified. It actually is computer code that spells out a sentence in the English language. So it is both an unlikely sequence of zeros and ones that matches a computer code that spells out a sentence in the English language, so therefore we would detect design. I like to give another silly example for explaining how complex and specified information, or CSI, works. This is Yodel. Yodel is from Eastern Europe, and he's going on a tour of mountains of the United States, okay? So first, Yodel goes to this mountain. He says, okay, this mountain has a very unlikely shape, right? I don't know if you guys can see my pointer here, but the odds of this mountain having a big ridge right here, and a ridge there, and a ridge there, and a gully there, and a gully there is very, very low. But when Yodel comes to this mountain, he's not going to say, oh, this mountain was designed. He's going to say, you know what, this looks like a normally shaped mountain. It has a shape that is very unlikely, but it's not specified to match some special pattern. I can easily explain this shape through natural processes like wind and erosion and heating and cooling and freezing and thawing, etc. So he's going to say, this mountain shape is natural, it was not designed. If you know how ID presentations go, you probably know where this is going next, because now Yodel comes to this mountain, right? He says, oh, this mountain also has a very unlikely shape, but it also matches a known pattern, namely the faces of 4 famous presidents. So now we have a specific pattern plus an unlikely shape, therefore we can detect design. And then, of course, he goes to the backside of Mount Rushmore and he finds out, congratulations, you just used information to detect design, okay? So now that we have sort of this basic understanding of complex and specified information and how in our experience it comes from intelligence, let's sort of drill down on how the theory of intelligent design works. So the first step that ID theorists do when they do an ID study is they first learn to recognize design in the natural world. And we do that by studying the world around us to identify the properties of objects which are always associated with intelligent design. For example, we can study objects in the world that we know were designed. Garden hoses, computers, books, languages. We can look at things that we know were designed and say, what are some special properties that we always find in objects that we know were designed? We can also study intelligent agents who are designing things. We can say, when intelligent agents act like human beings, what do we do? What do we produce? And by doing this, we can then develop what we call design detection criteria. Basically, we are making predictions based upon our understanding of what is found in designed objects, what intelligent agents do when they design things. And we can say, now when we find these design detection criteria, we can say that something was designed. And some of these criteria might be things like complex and specified information, CSI, other forms of information like irreducible complexity, when you have lots of a system that has to have lots of parts present in order for it to function. Blueprints, that's a good indicator of a design. Even just something having a purpose or a function could be an indicator of design, because designers always do things for a purpose. When we find parts being reused in different designs, you find cars that have wheels, you find airplanes that have wheels, parts being reused in different designs. That's another hallmark of the way designers operate. Coordination of parts, things that are fitting together, coming together to perform some function that has a purpose. That's another great indicator that something was designed. So we have all these design detection criteria, and we can then go out and we can seek to detect design in nature. So what does that look like? Basically, we study natural objects, and we say, okay, we're going to study this microscopic feature under the microscope, and we're going to see if it has these design detection criteria. Do we find complex and specified information? Do we find irreducible complexity? Do we find high information content, purpose, function, coordination of parts, blueprints, reusage of parts? These are all hallmarks of design and things that tell us that something was designed. And we find these different properties, these criteria are met, we can say that we are detecting design. Okay, so this is sort of very much a very basic, positive way that we can detect design by finding in nature the kind of information and complexity which in our experience always comes from intelligence. So I mentioned earlier that ID is an historical science. What does that mean, and how can we use science to study events of the past? Well, historical sciences study past events and try to determine what caused them. I like the way that Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist, put it. He said that historical sciences infer history from its results. And historical sciences often use what is called the principle of uniformitarianism. This is an idea that says that the present is the key to the past. Basically, we can study causes that are at work in the world around us in the present day, and then ask where those causes can help explain events of the past and where they're basically useful. Let me give you guys an example from my own field of geology of how this can work. Let's say that you observe in the present day that a stream is capable of stripping sediment away from a stream bed, okay? And over time, you actually observe that each year, this stream bed gets a little bit deeper. So you make this observation in the present day that water flowing through a stream bed is capable of stripping away sediment from a stream bed, okay? So you then infer that maybe over many years, a large stream or river could cut through an entire gorge. So when you come across this deep gorge, you say, you know what? Based upon my present day observation that water flowing through a stream can strip sediment away from a stream bed, maybe over a long period of time, this river could actually cut through and create this giant gorge, okay? This is using present day observations to explain events of the past. So how does this work with intelligent design? Well, it's really not that complicated. You have an ID theorist who starts off by observing that mind is the cause of certain kinds of information. And then she goes out into the natural world and she finds that exact same kind of information, which in her experience she already saw, always comes from her mind. And so then she infers that a mind was the cause of that information that she saw in the natural world. Sometime in the past, a mind designed that object that she has discovered. So this is how ID can function as a historical argument. ID is also a positive argument. What does it mean to be a positive argument? Well, maybe to show how something is a positive argument, I'll argue negatively and show you what a negative argument looks like. A negative argument might work like this. It could say, theory X is false. Okay, fine. In science, it's actually okay to say that. We can say in science that this argument doesn't work. This scientific theory is not explaining the evidence. It's therefore false. Negative arguments can be okay to use. But if you were to then say, theory X is false, therefore theory Y is true, this argument would have problems because evidence against one theory does not therefore necessarily in and of itself constitute evidence for another theory. So for example, if I were to say that natural selection cannot explain high levels of complex and specified information, or CSI, therefore intelligent design, That would not be a valid argument. We can't just say, okay, natural selection can't do it, therefore intelligent design. But the good news is that this is not how ID argues. ID is always looking for positive evidence. Again, we're finding in nature the kind of information and complexity which in our experience with the world around us, we already know always comes from intelligence, okay? So according to Stephen Meyer, when we are trying to use design detection methods, we can use a method what he calls comparing multiple competing hypotheses. Okay, so basically we're looking at different hypotheses and seeing which ones can explain the most data in the world around us. Okay, so the way this would work with intelligent design is when we find informational patterns which are known from experience to be produced only by intelligent agents, then we can make a positive inference that intelligent design is the best explanation. And this is what we might call detecting design. So intelligence is the cause of high CSI. Natural selection cannot generate high CSI, therefore we infer design. This is a valid argument, and this is how ID argues. We can also potentially falsify ID by finding a data set that would not be predicted by intelligent design, such as, for example, the claim that the genome is chock full of junk DNA. This is not something that ID would predict, but some other model might be better at explaining that. So if intelligence does not explain X, Y, and Z, but natural selection does explain X, Y, and Z, then we could falsify ID and say that ID really does not explain this data set. Turns out junk DNA isn't true, but that's for another time. Okay, so also, ID uses the scientific method to make its claims. Why does this matter? Well, the scientific method is often described as probably a four-step process of observation, hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion. And ID uses the scientific method to make claims in a variety of different scientific fields. But I'm going to just discuss how ID uses the scientific method in biochemistry right now. We start off with the observation that intelligent agents generate highly specified codes and irreducibly complex machines. We then make a hypothesis or prediction that biology will contain high, complex, and specified information codes and irreducibly complex machines. And then we can do experiments. Research has shown, such as research done by Douglas Axe, that when you study proteins, the amino acid sequence of a protein has to be just right in order for a functional protein to be able to work properly. It's basically high CSI. It's an unlikely sequence of amino acids that has to be in just the right order, matching just the right pattern for a protein to work. And so this is high CSI that Doug Axe has discovered in biology. And we also find that our cells are full of irreducibly complex molecular machines. If you went to Emily Reeves's talk, you learned about how we have these molecular machines in plants that generate energy. And biology is full of these molecular machines. So we can then, therefore, conclude that many complex features of living systems were designed. So ID is using the scientific method here to make its claims. So if you're going to argue that ID isn't science, look, I understand that we have science and we have non-science. And it might be very difficult to precisely define exactly what is the difference between science and non-science, okay? But I think it's safe to say that anything that is based upon the scientific method is going to be on the science side of this line. And it just so happens that ID uses the scientific method to make its claims. Okay, let's close up this talk now by discussing how we can apply intelligent design to figure out how nature operates and see what ID can help us to discover. So this is now the final step in our theory of intelligent design. Now that we've established that there is evidence for design throughout the natural world, ID theorists gain confidence in their theory. We can then model or predict what natural systems should look like if they were designed. Effectively, we're applying design detection criteria to predict what we should find in nature. And if the world was in fact designed, then these models will bear fruit, and ID can actually help us better understand how natural systems function and operate in the present day. So how do we do this? Well, we start with some natural object, and we ask the question, how does it work? And we say, okay, well, ID predicts that if this thing was designed, we're going to find things like CSI, information, irreducible complexity, blueprints, purpose, reusage of parts, coordination of parts, function, purpose, etc. So this then gives us a testable ID-based model to figure out how this natural object Y works. And we can go and apply these design detection criteria and help us better understand how natural systems work. So I'm going to go through some examples of this in just a moment, but for the moment, there's two basic types of ID research. And at Discovery Institute, we're actually funding and supporting a very large research program with scientists all around the world that are doing research into intelligent design. One type of research that they're doing is what we call pure design research. And this asks how, where, and when can we detect design in nature? And then the other type of research we're supporting is what we call applied design research. We're basically applying design reasoning to better understand how natural systems work. And let me give just a couple examples of each of those types of research. The first example is what we call our evolutionary waiting times project. How many of you guys went to Richard Sternberg's presentation in the previous breakout session? And he talked about how difficult it is to explain how quickly whales evolved from the fossil record. Well, this project is basically evaluating whether the geological record allows enough time for the mutations necessary to evolve new complex biological features. And this is a direct test of whether standard evolutionary mechanisms can produce the information in life or whether design is implicated. And this team has published 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers developing a mathematical model and is currently evaluating the evolvability of whales. They actually published a paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. It's hard to see that a couple years ago, and it's one of the top downloaded papers ever in that journal. So we're publishing papers in real, credible scientific journals, and hopefully this paper on whales will come out in the not too distant future. Also, applied design research. How can we apply design to do scientific research? Well, evolution has long predicted that our genomes will be filled with useless junk DNA. But because we observe that intelligent agents make things for a purpose, ID proponents have long predicted that junk DNA has a function. It's now known that ID was right. There have been literally thousands of scientific papers that have come out in the last 10 or 15 years showing that the vast majority of our genome is in fact functional. In fact, Rick Sternberg, again, was an early vanguard critic of junk DNA, publishing a 2002 paper in the journal Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, and Jonathan Wells' 2011 book, The Myth of Junk DNA, also highlighted a lot of the evidence that contradicts the junk DNA paradigm. And today our research program has quite a few scientists who are actually doing research looking at function for junk DNA, and we've launched a junk DNA work group to do research on this topic. One of my favorite examples of applied design research that we're supporting is a project that actually is headed up by Michael Egnor. You guys enjoyed his talk earlier today. He's a fantastic speaker. So Michael Egnor is a professor of neurosurgery at State University, New York, Stony Brook. And what he has thought about is the fact that when your heart beats, it pulses blood into your brain. But if these pulses of blood aren't carefully controlled, they would burst the fragile capillaries throughout the brain. So what he's done is he's predicted that the brain has a designed feature, what's called a band stop filter. It's a circuit regulation feature known from electrical engineering that helps to smooth out brain blood flow, much as this kind of a feature can smooth out electrical flow in a circuit. And he anticipates that his model of how brain blood flow works can lead to improved treatment of brain bleeds. And they published quite a few papers in peer-reviewed journals, and we're supporting their research right now to help them see if this is actually how brain blood flow works. Okay, final example of ID research. How many of you guys remember from your textbooks in biology this drawing of the vertebrate limbs, this famous icon of evolution? Well, almost every biology textbook has this drawing of vertebrate limbs. And what it says is that the structure of these different vertebrate limbs, a bat, a whale, maybe a horse leg, a human arm, the reason why these different vertebrate limbs have a very similar skeletal structure is because they all share a common ancestor, right? That's the basic argument. But what if there are good functional design reasons for why they have these similar skeletal structures? It's not because of common ancestry, it's because there are good functional reasons for reusing the same skeletal pattern over and over again. Well, over the last couple of years, we supported an engineer from the UK named Stuart Burgess to investigate the design of the vertebrate limb skeletal structure. And what he showed in a paper that he published in the journal Bioinspiration and Biomimetics last year is that the vertebrate limb structure is widespread not because of common ancestry, but because it is a good design. In his paper, he said it is highly versatile and optimal, not just for arms and legs, but also for flippers and wings, since it uses networks of segmented bones that enable smooth morphing of shapes as well as multifunctioning structures, which fine-tune motions and mechanical advantage. He recommends that humans mimic its structure in our own designs and says that vertebrate limb has significant potential for the bio-inspired design of robotic and prosthetic limbs. So we're basically taking down this icon of evolution, the vertebrate limb, and showing how we can build better robots through intelligent design at the same time. So if you want to know more about our research program, whip out your phone, take a picture of this QR code. This takes you to our research homepage. There are quite a few of the research projects we're supporting listed, but in fact, not even all of the research we're supporting can be listed on this website, because quite a few of the scientists that we're funding, they're still undercover in their support for intelligent design, and if it was known that they were pro-ID, they might actually lose their positions. But they published quite a few scientific papers. As of this presentation, our research program has now published 299 peer-reviewed scientific papers. We're very, very proud of this. So those people who say that there's no peer-reviewed science coming out of ID, it's wrong times 299, okay? So I don't know which paper is going to be 300. It'll probably come out very, very soon. And if you want to go to a list of not all these, again, some of them can't be listed publicly, but I think over 170 papers we've listed on our website. Take a picture of that QR code, and you can go to our website and get more information. So, conclusions. ID uses scientific methods of historical sciences to make predictive, empirically testable claims which are supported by the evidence. ID has an active research program that has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers. ID can be applied to guide research that discovers how the natural world operates in the present day. No matter how you slice it, ID is a bona fide scientific theory that is making advancements to lead biology into the 21st century. And we'd love for you to get involved with this. So if you're a scientist or a student, you want to get involved, come talk to us. And by the way, I want to dedicate this talk to two of our very good friends at Discovery Institute, Dr. Jonathan Wells and Dr. Gunter Beckley, who passed away in just the last few months. So in memoriam of our dear friends, Dr. Wells and Dr. Beckley, thank you very much.